And as we've said at the beginning of our conference, socialism, sexualization, and the antidotes. Will you welcome Michael Medved as he talks about some of the antidotes?
Thank you, Donna, and what a joy to be here. It is absolutely wonderful. I came out to Missouri in the very end of January for the weather. Actually, it is worse in Seattle where I live. And there are a number of things that are worse in Seattle where I live. But we won't go into them because they've been covered very well. We've heard about socialism from Jonathan. We've heard about sexualization from Michael. And by the way, I have a brother, Jonathan. So Jonathan and Michael, my brother was just on my radio show yesterday, as a matter of fact. And I want to begin by talking about how we change direction. And we do it best by understanding where we come from. If you want to figure out where you're going and where you should be going, we have to take a look at how we got here. And origins are important. And let me tell you a little bit of an origin story. I was debating whether or not to tell you this story, but Donna encouraged me because she was talking about airplanes and flying on long, long flights. Now, this is a true story. And it is, you will remember it, I promise, because it is so useful to explain to people why origins count. It's a story involving a famous rabbi who died 50 years ago. But his name was Yaakov Kamenetsky. And he was flying from Israel back to the United States, and he was flying with his grandson. And as is traditional, he was a great rabbi. His grandson was a teenager. He was a student. And the rabbi sat in first class because it's a very, very long flight. It's a long series of flights to go from Israel to the United States, and particularly a while ago it was. So he's up in first class, and he's seated next to the head of the Histadrut. Histadrut is the socialist labor union. It's the AFL-CIO of Israel. And almost definitionally, I don't think they've ever had a religious person who was head of the Histadrut. It's part of that secular establishment that used to run Israel. They don't anymore. But he's sitting next to and he says goodbye to his grandson. He goes back on the plane. But then when they get up and they turn off the no seatbelt sign, immediately his grandson comes up to first class. And he says, "Zeta, grandfather, can I help you?" And he helps his grandfather take his shoes off. He makes sure he gets a glass of water. He's an old man. He says, "What books can I bring you? What books do you want to study while you're flying?" And then he goes back again to the coach class. And several times more during what is a 10-hour flight, he comes back up to the front, and he's so solicitous of his grandfather. And after one of those last times when he is actually getting some socks for his grandfather out of his grandfather's bag so that he can be more comfortable, and being the head of the labor union, who's sitting next to the rabbi, says, "I hope you don't mind. I need to ask you a question. I have been watching your grandson, your Einikel." That's what you say in Yiddish. "I've been watching your grandson come up to you. He treats you so beautifully." Says, "I have grandsons. They don't give me the time of day. They think I'm a jerk. They don't do anything for me. What is your secret?" And so the rabbi fixes him with a very steady gaze. He says, "My secret is very simple. My grandson knows the truth, that I am 2 generations closer than him to Adam HaRishon, to the first man who was shaped directly by the hand of God. So he knows I am 2 generations closer to God. So naturally, he treats me beautifully. For your grandson, You're 2 generations closer to a monkey. If you believe that this miraculous machine called a human being arose through random chance and rolling the dice here, and then, I mean, first of all, it's profoundly illogical, but it means that you're going to have a different attitude on life. And if you believe that America is an accident, or even worse, that America is a great crime, if you deny what all of our founders and all of our leaders and all of the greatest American politicians have all believed, including a lot of the people on the left, that God was involved in shaping this country, that this country is not an accident, it is not the product of random evolution, it is the product of intelligent design and being designed for a purpose. And America's greatest need to combat socialism and sexualization and stupidity and the denial of the blindingly obvious that a man is not a woman. I mean, it's unbelievable. Michael Knowles is such a fantastic mind. And it's so, can you imagine that you would have to use the firepower of this intellect to prove something that basically my 3-year-old granddaughter understands? By the way, I'm going to interrupt for a granddaughter story, okay? Because okay. Somebody that I know told me this. I don't want to claim credit for it, but it's a beautiful saying. Being a grandfather is the one thing, being a grandparent is the one thing in life that isn't overrated. In any event, our granddaughter has an uncle, our daughter's husband, Mark, who's wonderful, who's an attorney. He's still wonderful. In any event, my son was doing a tape of his little girl, Julia, who's 3 years old, and he was doing a tape with her and asking what are people's jobs, and she says, what's Daddy's job? He says, Daddy works with computers. That's true. And he says, and what is Auntie Shayna's job? And Auntie Shayna, she teaches preschool, as she actually teaches the preschool Julia attends. Yeah, she actually runs that preschool. And then she's asked, okay, what about Uncle Mark? What does he do? She says, he's a lawyer. Okay, like that. He says, and what does a lawyer do? And she pauses for about 3 beats, big, beautiful brown eyes, red hair, my granddaughter. And Julia says, a lawyer helps you understand the rules. Okay? That's a wonderful and very hopeful definition of lawyers. She hasn't been watching impeachment, but in any event, what does this have to do with America and America being shaped by the hand of God? That's the rules. That's something that is incredibly obvious. It is built in. And it is so obvious that the best-selling history of the United States ever published was in 1876. It was 100 years after the Declaration. It was to celebrate the Declaration. It was 10 volumes. It was by George Bancroft, who, and this was an enormous bestseller. It used to be every educated American home would have Bancroft's 10-volume History of the United States. And the way Bancroft began the history of the United States was very simply this. He began his History of the United States, his opening declaration, which I use as an epigraph for my book. That's one of those dedication quotes. Made it very, very clear that in his view, no, the United States was no accident. It hadn't just come into being through some kind of combination of circumstances. What he said is, it is the purpose of this work, it is the object of this present work to explain the steps by which a favoring providence, calling our institutions into being, has conducted the country to its present happiness and glory. If you don't take that Bancroft idea that the reason we study history is to perceive God's hand and to try to discern his purpose for this great nation that he has created. If we don't do that, we're left with a dilemma. How do you explain the fact that we are the most powerful nation on earth? No one would have predicted it 500 years ago. Are you kidding me? North America is the last place you would have expected a dominant civilization to arise. It was sparsely settled. Sorry, it was. And even those historians who greatly exaggerate both the achievements and the population of Native Americans in North America, this continent was almost empty. The basic estimates are that there were about 3 million people living in North America, including the United States and Canada. Okay, and here we are the dominant power economically, militarily, culturally, and have been for the better part of 100 years? Yes, we have. How did that happen? If you don't see God's hand in it, you are left to believe, as so many people are taught today in our schools, as so many people come to believe, you are left to believe that it was some kind of a crime. It was a ripoff. It was a fraud. And this is why Howard Zinn and people of that nature, who goes along with following in the Frankfurt School that Donna was talking about, that Howard Zinn was a guest on my radio show a couple of times. And he crumbles like a house of cards. He has written the People's History of the United States, which is used as a textbook in high schools across the country. And it's an outrageous slander of America. It says, oh, America, because America's imperialistic, America's racist, America exploited slavery. The New York Times 1619 Project, which says that slavery was the defining issue of America, that was the defining institution, is part of that same idea. If you do not acknowledge the hand of Providence in shaping this country, you are left to believe that the United States is the product of criminal behavior. Imperialism, racism, slavery exploitation, suppression of women. Compare the United States to any other country on earth in regards to all of those things. And we come out remarkably well. So to deal with that, I wrote a book called The American Miracle. And the subtitle is Divine Providence and the Rise of the Republic. And it basically goes from the Pilgrims, whose 400th anniversary we're observing this year. It goes from the Pilgrims right up to one night, April 14th, 1865, when Abraham Lincoln, whose whole life was a miracle, and whose whole life makes no rational sense, the idea that this sublime writer, I don't believe there is a better writer of English prose ever than Abraham Lincoln. And this astonishing gift to the country, that he is just an accident. No, he was sent. And he believed it. He saw himself as an instrument. He said, an humble instrument of divine providence. Lincoln is killed April 14th, 1865. And I talk about that in the last chapter of American Miracle. And my brand new book, just released, is called God's Hand on America. And it picks up that same night, April 14th, 1865. Because some of you who are history buffs, and I know there are history buffs here, you know that there was another death that was supposed to happen that night. Actually, there were two more. The John Wilkes Booth conspiracy, and it was a conspiracy, was to kill Lincoln, to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson, and to kill the Secretary of State, William Henry Seward. And then the idea was that the country would be in such chaos, the South would rise again, and there would be more energy for secession. And okay, it was mad, it was evil. But here's what happened with Seward. And it is a remarkable story. And it's one that most Americans know nothing about. 9 days before the attempted assassination of Seward and the successful assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Seward is out for a carriage ride. The war is just about won. As it happened, by the way, the war was won. Appomattox was on Palm Sunday. Lincoln died on Good Friday. That's how close it was and how meaningful it was. In any event, Seward on April 5th of 1865 is out for a carriage ride with his two children, with Frederick Jr., who was his personal secretary, and his beloved daughter Fanny. And it's a spring day in Washington, and Washington can be very beautiful in the springtime, and they're going for this carriage ride. There is a banging, cluttering door in the carriage. And Seward bangs on the door, asks the coachman, please fix the banging door. The coachman gets out. He tries to fix the door, and they go on a little ways, and it's still banging. So what happened is that the coachman gets out again, and something happened to startle the horses. The carriage starts running down the Washington streets. There are 4 horses driving this carriage. It's a very scary situation. Seward, who's 63 years old, leans out, tries to grab the reins, and falls. And he fell face first. He broke his upper and his lower jaw. He broke an arm. He shattered 3 ribs. And he's lying there in a bloody heap. And his daughter and son assumed he was dead. He wasn't. They carry him back to his home, which was right across from the White House, across from Lafayette Park. And it was called the Old Clubhouse. And the doctors, to try to save his life and give him some chance so he could speak and function again, fit him with a contraption that has a metal plate to fit his jaw and canvas that wraps around it sort of like a mummy so that his jaw can heal. 9 days go by. Lincoln comes to visit him regularly. And suddenly on that Friday, that Good Friday, he can eat for the first time. He takes a little bit of mashed up fish and eats it. And, but it's through this whole contraption with the metal plate on his neck and his jaw and the canvas, but still, it sips it through a straw. And fish being eaten through a straw sounds absolutely disgusting, but look, he was alive. Okay, that night, that Friday night, there's pounding at the door at 10 o'clock. And people used to go to bed early because, of course, there's no electric light. And Seward is trying to get better. In any event, this huge, hulking stranger says, I have medicine to deliver for Secretary Seward. And his son eventually comes down to the door and says, well, the secretary is indisposed. He's not well. The whole world knew it. There'd been story for the Secretary of State having this near-fatal accident. And the stranger at that point starts pistol whipping his son, Frederick. Frederick was in a coma for 6 weeks. A coma because he was beaten around the head. But that beating breaks the gun that he had with him. So he rushes upstairs. He takes out a large knife with an 8-inch blade, a very large knife, and brings it down repeatedly. Some accounts say 4 times, some accounts say 7 times. Each time he brings it down to try to cut the jugular vein to make sure he kills the Secretary of State. And each time it strikes this steel plate that had been wrapped around his neck to heal his jaw. In other words, what had been, everyone perceived to have been a disaster and nearly killed him, actually saved his life. And it very clearly did. Now, why is all this important? Seward did not find out until days later. As he was still recovering, he was wounded badly on the cheek, but he survived. And his son Frederick survived and ended up having a good and wonderful long life. What happened? Why was this important? He found out days later that Lincoln had died. And he was really the only thing in a disastrous administration that really was falling apart, Andrew Johnson, that kept the administration on track And he did an unbelievable deal to acquire Alaska. There is no historian who has argued that if Seward is not alive, if he does not survive this attack, Alaska continues to be what it always had been, Russian America. Now, this is important. Why is it so important? Okay, fast forward, 2017. It's 150 years after Seward makes his deal for what was called Seward's Icebox. They only called it Seward's Folly later. Seward's Icebox, Horace Greeley tells you, he said this was Walrussia. Get it? Like walrus, because they only had walruses up there. It was useless. It was pointless. But Seward was running the country. Do you know why? Because the president was in the midst of an impeachment crisis and couldn't function. And so Seward buys Alaska. Vladimir Putin in 2017 calls a convocation of leading scholars, poets, musicians to observe the darkest day in Russian history when they gave Alaska to America for pennies. And Putin said, and all his historians, court historians, agreed with him because they wanted to preserve their health, that had Seward not made this deal, Russia certainly would have won the Cold War. Certainly would have won the Cold War. And one of the court historians for Putin said, imagine if we had had missiles both in Cuba and in Juneau, Alaska. That would have been something for those Amerikansky SOBs. Well, they didn't get it. And it wasn't an accident. And Seward knew it wasn't an accident. He knew he had lived for a purpose. Now, there's something else that Seward did, and this connects with one more story in the book, and then I want to conclude with you. But a lot of you, we have some attorneys here. Any attorneys? What's that? Well, who help us understand the rules? Come on. All right. I don't know if any attorneys here have ever been aware of the Guano Islands Act of 1857, one of the proudest achievements of the Buchanan administration. The Guano Islands Act provided for, guano is bird dung. I mean, it's bird droppings. And it was very valuable in the 19th century because it helped with agriculture. It could help grow things with it. And so the Congress passed and the president signed the Guano Islands Act that said that any guano islands that were not claimed by another country could be claimed by the United States, and they would recognize the president's ability to do that. Okay, Seward's in the middle of the negotiations now on Alaska, and working with, by the way, a phony baron who wasn't really a baron, he wasn't really a Russian, but he was representing the Russians. That's another story. Okay, so Seward comes across some papers and some letters from a sea captain who has discovered some islands, and he thinks it would be perfect islands to add to America under the Guano Islands Act. Seward takes a look at the map. The total land area of these little tiny islands, there are 3 of them, is 2.5 miles, 2.5 square miles. But still, a lot of guano. There are only birds there. Nobody else lives there. Seward signs the papers, and in the middle of a negotiation for Alaska, which is, of course, adding, it's 4 times the size of Texas, Alaska. It's big. Seward adds these little specks of 2.5 square miles to the country. Signs a paper, doesn't wait for the president to do it. He does it, Secretary of State. And that's how Midway Island became part of the United States. William Henry Seward doesn't survive. World War II goes differently. And there is so much about the Battle of Midway. There's an extensive chapter about the Battle of Midway. People who experienced it called it a miracle, including people like Chester Nimitz, who was head of the Pacific Fleet. Admiral Nimitz was not a believer. He was a skeptic. But he saw God's hand at Midway. And for people who don't know the story, and there was a pretty decent movie that came out that was surprisingly accurate in terms of portraying it, but it did not portray the godly elements, the haunted elements. There's a book, a wonderful book, no longer in print, imagine that, called God Was at Midway. But there are others, incredible victory, miracle at Midway. You have 3 squadrons of planes that take off from these 3 aircraft carriers. We are badly outnumbered by the Japanese. They've destroyed our fleet and our resources and our airplanes at Pearl Harbor. And they have the best aircraft carriers in the world. And they have what is still the largest naval armada ever assembled, the Kido Butai, the strike force, which they are going to hit Midway and then go on to take Hawaii and then capture the West Coast, Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles. Okay. These 3 squadrons from 3 different carriers all get lost. They're lost over open ocean. They're looking for the Japanese fleet. They miraculously find one another, and then they follow what looked to be a white arrow in the ocean that suddenly was there. And they find their way to the Japanese fleet, and in 5 minutes, they sink 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers. They got the 4th one a couple of hours later. Nothing like it in the history of warfare. Utterly, utterly remarkable. Now, here's the part that nobody knows because it's too politically incorrect. One of the guys on board the Japanese flagship, this giant aircraft carrier, is the largest carrier in the world. It's called the Akagi, went down to the bottom of the ocean. But one of the officers on board the Akagi was named Mitsuo Fushida. And he was an ace pilot. He had been decorated by Emperor Hirohito. He had been the pilot who said Tora, 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 who led the attack on Pearl Harbor. He led both of the attack waves were led by Mitsuo Fushida. He had the highest Japanese equivalent of Medal of Honor. He had suffered appendicitis 3 days before the battle. They removed his appendix. He couldn't fly. So he survived. He broke both legs. But what he saw at Midway, it changed him. He wrote about it extensively after the war. And a number of other things happened, which I describe in the book. But in 1947, Mitsuo Fushida, the lead pilot at Pearl Harbor, accepted Jesus Christ as his Lord and Savior and became an outspoken, he wrote a little pamphlet, again out of print, alas, but it's wonderful reading. It's called God's Samurai. And it's about how God changed his heart, and he spent the last 15 years of his life expressing his love for God and his love for God's country, the United States of America. Mitsuo Fushida appeared 9 times with Billy Graham on various crusades. Unbelievable story. And another indication of God's hand on America. There are so many, and it is so much a part of our heritage. It seems to me almost a crime that we forget it. John Adams wrote, "I always consider the settle of America with reverence and wonder, as the opening of a grand scene and design in Providence for the illumination of the ignorant and the emancipation of the slavish part of mankind all over the earth." Do you know when he wrote that? 1765, long before the Revolution. But it was obvious to him. It should be far more obvious to us. Look around. I had the privilege of going over to Anne's house earlier this evening, and I was talking to a number of people. People were talking about wonderful marriages, wonderful families, terrific children. We are so blessed to be here. Let us embrace our blessings. Do we have problems in this country? Of course we have problems. We have tremendous problems. And yes, we have problems with socialism and sexualization. But if we understand that we as Americans have a purpose to fulfill, and the purpose is what John Adams talked about. It's not just to provide a nice and wonderful and uplifting home for ourselves. It's a purpose to change the whole world. And that's why God uses America. Last word here. A lot of people say, I mean, the late Jerry Falwell, and it's a wonderful line, and it has a lot of meaning and resonance. He used to say, if God doesn't destroy San Francisco soon, he's going to have to apologize to Sodom and Gomorrah. And the point about God blessing America and God shedding his grace on thee, on you and me, on all of us, is not a reward for good behavior. It's not. It's what Lincoln said. It's the use of the United States as an instrument. And the point is, we were at a hearing before about grace from Jonathan. And the idea is grace is undeserved. America right now, with so much of the craziness we have going on, we may not deserve God's grace, but he is going to continue to use America as his instrument. And it will enormously, enormously aid that process if we can make sure that American young people understand the history of America being the instrument of God's will. Dr. Martin Luther King, who has a chapter in my new book, Dr. King said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." And somebody very, very different from Dr. King, Otto von Bismarck, the great Iron Chancellor of Germany, once said, "It is the job of the statesman to listen for God's footsteps in history and then to grab his coattails and hang on." When the Washington Post, good old Washington Post, reviewed my book, God's Hand on America, they gave it a very prominent review. I was glad of that. They chose a professor to review my book, professor of history at the University of Oslo in Norway. And while the professor had very good things to say about my skill as a writer and as a storyteller, I was very pleased to see it. He said, most other historians would say that America has benefited from many, many accidents, happy accidents that have benefited the country. And right in my book, and he doesn't acknowledge it, I take on that argument. A pattern of happy accidents is still a pattern. And it still blesses America and gives us evidence of intelligent design, not random evolution. America's no accident. This great conference is no accident. The abilities of the kind of leaders that you're going to hear, like my two colleagues here, of Donna, of Anne, of so many people who contribute, this is no accident. This is part of our ability to serve as instruments for uplifting humanity, for saving the world. That's why God blesses America. If God is going to use any nation, was he going to use Belgium, right? No, this is the tool, this is the instrument, this is the place. And we will continue. If we can teach our children some of the thrilling and encouraging and gratitude-inducing stories of our past, because let me tell you something. Gratitude is better than guilt when it comes to your attitude toward your nation. If you believe that your nation is guilty, 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 and the most cruel and the most oppressive, first of all, it's going to make you a miserable person. Last point. My wife and I together wrote a book some time ago called Saving Childhood, Protecting Our Children from the National Assault on Innocence. And one of the things we dealt with in that book was this idea of self-esteem, that all you needed to do to help children is build up their self-esteem. Now, there have been a number of psychological studies, my wife's a PhD clinical psychologist, that show that career criminals have very, very high self-esteem. Some of the worst people in the world had sky-high self-esteem. If you want to raise good children, if you want to raise children who contribute, then you don't want to teach them, hey, I'm a great kid. I'm such a great kid. You want to teach them, this is a great world. This is a great country. I am grateful for it. I want to be worthy for it. And you all will be, are, and continue to be worthy of being children of this greatest nation on God's green earth. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.